and welcome back to the second and final roundtable session for the day. We're absolutely delighted to welcome Sauvagnargues and Yuk Hui with us today in what will be a similarly broad discussion scoping out some of the various themes of Simondon's work and the myriad ways through which it can be navigated and approached. And we want to try and again keep this as relaxed as possible. So by way of just sort of introductions, Sauvagnargues' rich work
Sauvagnargues. Yeah, Sauvagnargues.
Sauvagnargues' rich work is perhaps best known, although is not reducible to her development of various aspects of Deleuze and Guattari. For example, Deleuze's transcendental empiricism. And, if I may, at times seems to approach Simondon in part through his key sort of anti-substantialist arguments through his whole notion of processes of individuation, or, for example, in the always partial individuation of matter in signs and images within their own imbricated ecologies, in that sort of complex Deleuzean play between the virtual and the actual. She has published a number of texts on Deleuze, art, Spinoza, and among other topics, as well as two texts that have been translated into English. It's still two, yes. Deleuze and Art in 2013, first published in French in 2005, and the more recent Art Machines, Deleuze, Guattari, Simondon in 2016. Yuk Hui's work, which builds on his own background in computer engineering and philosophy, and in particular in his 2016 book on the existence of digital objects, manages to continuously combine depth and breadth through his careful readings of various figures in the history of philosophy, from Kant to Hegel to Husserl to Heidegger to Simondon to Stiegler, and, if I may say, appears to be very much in that Simondonian lineage of attempting to reconcile culture and technics. In addition to the aforementioned book, he has also published another entitled The Question Concerning Technology in China, an essay in Cosmotechnics in 2016, and a forthcoming 2019 book, which promises to be fascinating, entitled Recursivity and Contingency. So yeah, we're once again delighted to welcome you here. So I'm going to try and attempt some symmetry in some aspects of the way Ian approached the talk earlier today by asking some broad background questions at the beginning and end that can hopefully just make it all nicely endosomatic. So just to kick us off, how would you situate Dumod specifically within the context of Simondon's work, given some of the discussions we already had about this before? And given situating Dumod in whatever way you do, what kind of a philosopher is he for you? What has he done to philosophy that is different than others before him or after him? And that's, I will start. Do you want to start, you? Or you?
Yep.
Okay.
I start first.
Okay, no, it's okay.
Okay.
So the question is what is miot? Yeah? Okay.
Sure. Yeah, what is miot?
So miot would be the abbreviation for mode of existence of technical objects, right? I was very much interested by the discussion, the first discussion between Cecile and Simon, and I would like maybe to add some ideas. And the first thing I would like to emphasize is that it is this book is part of Simondon's PhD attempt to achieve this PhD, and you have to consider that in France in those days you had to achieve two PhD. You have to achieve a major PhD, and this would be the book on individuation, and you have to do another thesis, a little thesis, and this would be the mode of existence of technical objects. Now, what is fascinating for people who are a little bit familiar with Simondon is to discover that he was capable to do both on the same time. So first, an immense philosophical book on the question, which is a very simple question in philosophy, the question of individual. But then he transforms the question of individual totally. And this is necessary for you to understand how he was capable to do, on the same level, this big book, the metaphysical book on individuation, and this really impossible to understand in the philosophical scene of 58, this type of completely strange object, the book on the technical objects. And in order to understand this, let me go back to the situation in France when Simondon was writing. And you have to consider that, because it is a PhD, so Simondon, you know what it is, yeah? Some of you are writing PhDs. So a PhD is not only a matter of creativity, right? It is also a matter of institutionalization, right? And so the philosophical scene in 58 was completely, not prepared to integrate either both books, either the book on individuation nor the book on technical objects. Now, this is sufficient for the first way to put it. Now, understand that Simondon did the first PhD under the direction of a great French metaphysician called Jean Hippolyte, and he is the guy who introduced Hegel in France. So he's completely only onto, let's say, institutionalized metaphysics for French in the 50s, because in those days it was important to go back to German philosophy. And the other book was and the other thesis, the second, was under the supervision of somebody who is totally different from Hippolyte, not a major figure for the Sorbonne, right? But and the second PhD advisor is Georges Canguilhem, which is an epistemologist. And in order for you to understand this, let's say that Georges Canguilhem, the author of The Normal and the Pathological, right? He wrote this during the war. Georges Canguilhem had in 58 at least two interesting PhD students. The first one would be Simondon, the second one would be Foucault, right? So you have to understand this. And so Georges Canguilhem is really transforming the way we are doing philosophy, because philosophy is no longer related to the history, the tale, the narrative of colonial metaphysics bound to the Greek beginning and developing with German philosophy the capacity to bring up a new theology. Philosophy with Canguilhem is no longer dedicated to this metaphysical narrative. It is dedicated to the diagnosis of civilization inside the epistemology of philosophy. So it's very different. Canguilhem has a critical point of view, and his critical point of view has something to do with the construction of knowledge, right? And so Canguilhem accepted this PhD from a completely unknown student on the history of madness. This would be the PhD from Foucault. But he accepted at the same time this completely crazy PhD from Simondon on the existence of technical objects. And this is very much interesting. Now, the second idea is that there is a completely different way to understand this epistemological criticism. Let's say that they are inventing critique and cultural studies in the 50s, right? There are two different ways to do this. One would be the Foucault way, and the second one would be the Simondon way. So the incredibly interest of Simondon's book is that he doesn't do the same thing as Foucault. He does not consider the discourses on techniques. He does not consider the discourses. So Foucault, proposing a history of madness, would go back to the representation about madness and to the institutions that are molding madness into society. So Foucault has an external point of view, and he's talking about this subject, but from the point of view of a scholar. I love Foucault, but then it is a point of view of a scholar, because he is on the level of discourse. Now you have to realize this title, On the Mode of Existence of Technical Object, raises up a entirely new question. And this new question would be, is there a type of existence that is specifically technical And this is a completely new question. So this is it would be the answer to your question. Let me explain it. Is this a technical object? Probably it is. Now the idea of Simondon is, in order to understand this, let me take an example that is more mechanical. In order to understand this, I cannot consider only the level of its objectality. And so there is a trick in the title, because when you say on the mode of existence of technical object, you may believe, and this is exactly what you were talking about here, because you may believe that Simondon would be interested in a kind of new zoology of a new type of population, this new type of population being the technical object. But if you do so, you may consider that Simondon is only an empiricist, or doing something for the technical world that has been done in the 18th century by Linnaeus, right? Linnaeus for the life domain. Only a classification. This is absolutely not what Simondon is doing. He's not doing classification. What he's doing is an inquiry about existence. So that, for Simondon, technical objects cannot be taken, this is another point which is very important and quite difficult to explain. Technical objects cannot be taken on the level of their actualization. What does it mean? Technical object is not only on the level of something that is actualized here, right? And so if I need to understand the existence of a technical object, and it can be a very smart phone, a very smart tool at this, or it can be a very simple one. So, for instance, a fork or a hammer, even a hammer, which is only a tool, cannot be understood on the level of its individuated state. And so, insofar, I do connect both theses completely, very, very deeply together, because it is because of his new theory of individuation that Simondon is capable to address the world of technicity, inventing this new metaphysics, arguing that in fact technicity is a mode of relationship into the social life, so that because we do not acknowledge technical individuated objects as being a part of our social agency, therefore we are not capable to understand culture. We are not capable to understand culture because the main frame in which we address the existence of technical objects does not allow us to understand what we are actually doing. So this would be a political and social philosophy, which is very much interesting. But then, Simondon was not really a revolutionary guy. He's very old-fashioned, got a wife, 7 children, goes to church, speaks in Latin, and loves Greek. And he wondered, for his second thesis, he wondered if he should do a thesis on technical objects or on Latin literature and linguistics. So you don't believe that Simondon was the guy who was really into technology for materialistic reasons. It's not the case. And the other thing, and it is one of the reasons why Simondon was not understood at all in France in 1958. The other thing is because of his theory of individuation. I'm going to shorten up, because of his theory of individuation, he never takes the level of existence of technical objects on the level of one individuated artifact. But then it is very much interesting for him that technical objects are capable to individuate themselves, because it means, and this is a quasi-organism, because they have a life all of their own. Yeah, they do. Yeah, please take my phone. So, right?
Heavy.
Okay. Yeah, it's heavy because Okay, so they have a certain kind of agency of their own. And this is the question of Simondon. What type of agency? And this agency is obviously human, but then from a point of view, that would be the point of view of nowadays. And the urge nowadays to bring up a philosophy of ecology, a new type of philosophy of ecology that allows us to think together, animality and technicity, right? And this is the task for philosophy today. So Simondon is capable to address us and to say very simply, it is impossible to understand, let's say, it is not Simondon's question, but it is ours. It is impossible to understand the level of capitalism and the joint between industrial capitalism and, let's say, electronic and digital capitalism without going back to an analysis of this kind of agency that technical objects have. And so technical objects are no longer objects. This is what you have to understand. They are not an object, an objectality. They have a certain kind of social agency, and so we have to consider them as social agents. And if we don't do so, we cannot understand our situation. And this means that society does not involve only humans. And this is for ecology very crucial. Because maybe you think that your existence is only a human one. But then what I say to my students is very easy. I say, it's probably impossible for you to exist without animals and vegetables. And you may say yes, because you eat probably every other day or so, right? But then it is equally impossible to understand human existence without taking in consideration that we are in symbiosis also with matter and material elements. And some of our students do not believe me. And then I say, well, it's easy. Stop to breathe. Stop to breathe. And so this type of opening is a type of opening that is in itself ecological. And therefore, for Simondon, society is not only the question of humans. Society is the questions of human, ecological, let's say, natural forces, if we can say this for now, and social agentivities deposed in the artifact world. But then, what is very incredibly interesting by Simondon is that he does not address the question of technicity from the level of the use. So technicity, it is impossible to understand technical objects if you do consider them only from the use, from the side of the user. Use is no longer a good concept to address technology. So no use. But then he says also that technology cannot be understood if you take this as an applied knowledge of scientificity. And so this is the second impossibility for Simondon. You cannot rely technology to science. So, and this is exactly what explains his purpose. You have to find a certain level of consistency, a consistency that is not the consistency of theory, because this would be Platonician, right? The consistency of technicity cannot be the consistency of high developed scientific theories. It has a consistency of its own. And this consistency has to be analyzed as a mode of existence. And therefore, the technological inquiry in the level of technicity that Simondon lived with, that is a certain level of motoristic and electronics, let's say a pre-digital stage of contemporary capitalism. Right.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive answer. Yuk?
I think so. Thank you very much, Anne, for the explanation that saved a lot of time. This book, Du mot d'existence des objets techniques, was written in a particular time. It's the time that there was a population of devices based on quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. So you see child, you see diode, you see transistor, and this is very important. Because the analysis of Simondon starts with this, what he called a technical element. But we come back to this again. Now, it is the question of quantum mechanics and also cybernetics. The epicenter to Simondon is an epistemological rupture. And this was true because he was a reader of Gaston Bachelard. So the question of information become, the notion of information seems to him an epistemological rupture to rethink the question of individuation. That's the reason for which the title of the principal thesis is Individuation in the light of the notions of form and information.
Mm-hmm.
Now the form here refers to Gestalt psychology, and this is extremely important. Gestalt psychology, because it was so important, for example, also Merleau-Ponty, and of course the book was dedicated to Merleau-Ponty. But also the notion of information developed in cybernetics, in the theory of information, that allows Simondon to reconceptualize individuation, and that is why how the metaphysical project starts with such an epistemological rupture. And Simondon has, and we have to also pay attention to the fact that if the principal thesis is about individuation. Now, in the supplementary thesis, we don't see so much about individuation. I mean, of course, the individuation is everywhere, but he didn't say individuation of technical object. It said individualization of technical object. Mm-hmm. This is completely different. So what does it mean? What is it? But of course, it is the effort. I mean, what I'm trying to do is always trying to understand the gap in between these two and how can we really think of the project of Simondon today. Now let's start with come back to the question of individualization. The study of individualization is in the first 2 pages of the introduction, we see that Simondon wanted to respond to a problem. This problem is alienation. He wanted to respond to the problem of alienation in a way different from Marx. How different is it? Marx tried to resolve the problem of alienation from the perspective of political economy. Simondon says that this is not sufficient. In order to resolve the problem of alienation, you must study the evolution of technical objects. Why is this the case? Because when Simondon says that, especially when he takes this lineage from technical elements, technical individuals to technical ensemble, is extremely important and problematic as well. The technical individual is, so let me simplify this, is that at the time of the artisan, me as artisan, I am able to create an associate milieu for the tools, for the technical object, for example, the hammer, the saw, so on. And me as a human being, I perform the function of an associated milieu. And it is in this case that I am the technical individual. But this was no longer the case in the time of after industrialization, that is to say in the factories. This machine, this automat, have their own associated milieu. So human beings, when they face these machines, there was a malaise. The malaise originates from the problem that they are not able to adopt these machines, and they have to adapt to these machines, to their rhythm, to the movement, and so on and so forth. So there is a malaise, and this is the problem of one of the sources of alienation. Now here the question of information comes in again. Simondon says that we have to fight against this alienation by thinking the possibility opened up by information technology, that is to say, the technical ensemble. Is it possible to reorganize these information machines so that we can we can resolve the problem of alienation? Where is this from? And of course, this is related to cybernetics. Maybe we can go a step behind, which is in the 1940s. of course, there was influence of Georges Canguilhem, especially his Canguilhem's reading of another sociologist, Georges Freeman. Freeman has a book describing the alienation due to industrial technology and so on. But Freeman has a very strange idea. He says that now, before, the human beings have to adapt themselves to machines. But now it is possible to create an organic condition that the machines will be part of the organic structure or organic operation, so we can resolve alienation. This was taken up again by Canguilhem, because Canguilhem has written a review of this book. So there is this idea of through reorganization of the information machines that maybe there's possibility to resolve the problem of alienation. And that was the belief of Simondon, that was the very opening of du mot d'existence des objets techniques. So there is a technical lineage which is necessary for Simondon in order to understand where is the alienation from, in what way can we resolve it with this new technological condition opened up by cybernetics. And there is also the ambivalence between Simondon's attitude towards cybernetics. And that I try to address in my talk, because is cybernetics in this sense a problem solver? At the time of Simondon, it seems like. And so the engagement between Simondon and cybernetics, where I try to work out in my new book, and also I will talk about in my talk as well. But this is the background of talking about individualization, but there's also a way to think of individuation. This question of individuation of technology only came in the third part of the book, when you talk about technicity. And here, I will try to suggest, maybe because tomorrow we will talk about techniques and culture, that in different parts, in part 1, part 2, and part 3, that actually we see the concept of what Simondon called the culture change over time. Because culture is a very difficult word, but you see that how he described culture change over time from part 1, part 2 to part 3. And we have to pay attention to that, to see that how he progressively moving from one from like the individualization, or what he called the technical concretization, towards the genesis of technicity. So there's a kind of a progress, that how he tackled the problem of alienation.
Thank you. So as with the previous roundtable, feel free to, of course, at any point raise the hand, make interjections as you see fit. I realise I didn't say that, so please do feel free. So unless there are any now, sorry, yes?
No, okay.
Okay.
I would like to add something on alienation, if it's possible.
Sure. Can I just ask this question and then incorporate the two? Because I wanted to come back to the hammer, which has come up now almost every 10 minutes. And because I was thinking about another thinker who we haven't brought up yet, who has a very different relationship to cybernetics, and that is obviously Heidegger. And it seems to me that, especially on this notion of the hammer, is there some sort of, for you, implicit association or disassociation between Simondon and Heidegger as two very different or sometimes similar thinkers of techniques? And I just wanted to hear some thoughts that you might have on that relation. Anything else you want to say, of course?
Can I?
Of course.
Yeah. Add something on alienation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is very interesting, this point of alienation, because it explains also the difference, the way, let's say, the difference between Simondon and Marxism in France in those days. And this is important in the late 50s, but it would become more and more important in the 60s and in the 70s in France. And it's part of the reason why Simondon was so ignored. The idea of Simondon is that it is impossible to understand human alienation if you only take technique as something that is molded from the outside. And so the alienation that Simondon intends to overcome is not the alienation of humans, it is the alienation of culture itself. And this is completely different. And it means, so if you want to take this in consideration, that for Simondon it is impossible to explain technicity on an anthropomorphical level, and this is really radical. You cannot understand technicity with anthropomorphism. That is, you cannot understand technicity from the point of view of the human user, or from the point of view of the social mode of production, so that technicity is not reducible to knowledge. I said this before, to scientific knowledge. It is not reducible to user-friendly stuff, exactly. It is not reducible to the condition of labor. This is against Marx. And this is very, very crucial to understand that this alienation, which in the introduction partly, Simondon is responding to Freeman, he's trying to take place in the debate, right? And saying, well, everybody hates technicity. Every humanist philosopher in the Sorbonne, of course, hates technicity and reads Heidegger. This is part of my answer, right? And so hates technology because they have a completely idealistic and, let's say, old-fashioned way to cut between thought and reality. And because, and this is only, a matter of social conditioning, because it is related with the fact that in Western culture, and only in Western culture, which is, it's a very tiny portion of time, right? In Western culture, it seems to be completely obvious to establish a sociological difference between the thinker, vita contemplativa, and the worker, vita activa. So that the alienation for Simondon, it is not the alienation of the worker who suffers in these conditions. And Simondon does not want to say that industrialization is good. It is not, right? But it cannot be addressed on the level of the human alienation. It has to be addressed on the level of the alienation of cultures that allows us to be part of the machine. And this is to be part of the mechanical terrorization of the industrial process, right? But then you cannot address the question of the human and the machine from this type of relationship. You have to address it in understanding that our type of culture has been incapable, let's say, since the 18th century, because Greek culture was not techno-phobic. Plato takes a lot of technological examples, right? Aristotle is obviously not technophobic. Diderot is not technophobic. So this technophobia you're addressing is post-Kantian, and Heidegger is completely in this. And so Heidegger sees the technical object only from the level of use and Dasein, which is not anthropomorphical in the sense of, let's say, philosophy of the 18th century, but it is remaining under the dispositif where human is the only Dasein. Only Dasein. Is this possible today? I say yes, and we have all the things that we have today. We have climate change, we have digital capitalism. And so if we want to address this, we have to stop, to cease to consider human beings as being in an empire in an empire. And this is exactly what Simondon allows us to do, right?
I think we have to disagree
on
that point.
I know.
On the question of Heidegger. But let me try to.
Le bar de Nazi continue ses effets.
Well, I know that whenever I talk about Heidegger, especially in Germany, I'm often seen as a fascist.
Nazist.
Let's come back to the question of the hammer. The hammer. When I try to oppose the question of technical object, I see Simondon and Heidegger as two figures who wanted to try to take technical objects seriously in the 20th century. but in a really different way, and maybe sometimes the opposite. But at the same time, they converge. And this is not what I said, it's Simondon himself said so, towards the end of the month. The name Heidegger was mentioned. Now, what is the difference between these two is that Heidegger was so critical of what he called vorhanden, present at hand. And to understand that if when we use the hammer, we don't really schematize the hammer. We use it as if it's a part of the temporality that we are with it. They call it Besorgen. And this he called the Zuhanden, the ready to hand. So Heidegger, when he talked about technical objects, he preferred, or he tried to enter into a kind of semiotics when we worked with a technical object. On the other hand, when Simondon talked about the individualization of technical objects, it is always about the schemas, the technical schemas, the concretization and the evolution of the technical schemas, which are, we can say, the levels of complexity of causality within the operation of the technical object itself. So from this perspective, it seems like they are really different. One wanted to understand the technical objects as a Zuhandener and see how it evolved according to schemes and causalities, and other want to see how a technical object participates in our everyday life. The kind of the Besorgen, the I don't know what is it, how is it translated into English?
Care.
No, Sorge is care, but Besorgen is has a specific translation.
Then you know?
What's translated as concern. Sorry, concern. But these two of them seems to provide us two perspectives to look into technical objects. And I was with Heidegger in order to say that maybe with Heidegger that we will be able to understand or develop a certain theory of the individuation of technical objects, which Simondon didn't talk about.
So individual, pardon?
Individuation of technical object.
Action?
Individuation of technical object.
Individuation. Okay.
Not individualization. Maybe it is possible to develop a speculative understanding of the individuation of technical object and what it would be. That was my effort. That was what I tried to do more than 10 years ago. But of course, at the time, as a young student, everyone was influenced by speculative realism. But then I rejected, of course. Now I will tackle the question of technophobia of Heidegger. But it's a big question. I don't know if we can really talk about Heidegger as a technophobia or not. For myself, I think that Heidegger is not a technophobia. Heidegger understands that the question of technology is the most important question in philosophy. If we wanted to continue to think, we have to face the question of technology. But the problem may be that the solution or this critique of modern technology and the exodus that Heidegger proposed is never is very different from Simondon. If I can say so, I think that Simondon wanted to overcome modernity through modernity, but that was not the case. That was not very clear, not very precise with Heidegger. Yeah.
But very interesting. But would you say that Simondon addresses Heidegger when he is building his theory of technicity? Or would you say so?
Yes. Because
would you say so?
Because there was a clear reference to Heidegger. Simondon didn't say where is it from. Well, Simondon says precisely like this. He says, let me find out the quote here.
Yeah.
He says, I cite, when he was talking about the students seeing the clock of the observatory, for example, he said, these forms of respect and of disrespect manifest within the technicity that is integrated into the natural and human world, the inherences of values surpassing utility thought that recognize the nature of technical reality is that which, going beyond separates objects, utensils, according to Heidegger's expression. This covers the essence and reach of technical organization beyond separates object and specialized occupations. Where is this from? This is the opening of the 1949 essay, Die Frage nach der Technik, the question concerning technology of Heidegger. He says if we want to understand technology, we must go beyond the anthropological understanding in order to see what is the essence of technology. And this is a clear response to that. So what does it mean by going beyond this, the specificity? This is the key question of the genesis of technicity. Where he developed by drawing a speculative history of technology, starting with the magic phase. But where is this magic phase from? He never mentioned.
Iliad.
But I think
It's Iliad.
Iliad, but also I think that is probably even more relevant is Fraser, James Fraser.
Yeah, probably.
Because Fraser did mention this magical phase in his book, I forgot what it's called.
Iliad
Iliad, of course.
And Iliad is the guy who
Exactly, he also, when he talked about temple.
Hierophany, right?
Yeah. So there is this kind of convergence with Heidegger, but but I would say that Heidegger, where the response of Simondon is more explicit, like it suggests how are we going to deal with technology and so on. But I also think that there was something that we can identify in Heidegger, and that is where I developed the concept of Cosmotechnics. But I probably cannot explain, we cannot go into details here.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe shift gears again, maybe away from sort of exegetical stuff and towards maybe the subtitle of the conference, which you already hinted some approach to this with Simondon's, as it were, conservatism in some sense. And that is his politics, or maybe what politics or what political philosophy we can derive or extract from Dumod. So in Dumod, Simondon makes a number of remarks and suggestions for integrating a more thorough technical education into pedagogical institutions, and this pedagogical maturation in relation to technics he calls his general encyclopedism, in that sort of enlightenment spirit that we talked about in the first half. So allow me to say that this is a sort of political thing, integrating sort of technical education into sort of changing the human-technical relation, building on that discussion of slavery from earlier. So just for you, what kind of a politics do you think we can extract from Dumod? And why, for example, is it not just as simple as ensuring that all children learn how to code and do basic engineering? What might a political agenda of individuation from a Simondonian perspective look like for you? And whoever wants to go first.
Well, I don't know. To be honest, for me, Simondon is not a political thinker. Simondon has no big thing to say about politics. He was not very much into politics. But of course, we have to reinvent Simondon as a political thinker. Is possible, and some people are doing that. For example, André Bardin has written a book on politics and epistemology in Simondon. So Simondon as a political thinker, or the question of politics, we have to reinvent with Simondon, because but this reinvention is not easy. Why? Because what Simondon has said, many things are already realized today. the kind of, so for example, in terms of education, you know that like how to use information machines and so on. It seems like this is a part of our education today, and technology, especially artificial intelligence and machine learning, these are now state politics. These are now state policies. These are considered by the state to be part of geopolitics. When Putin, last year, the 1st of September, he says that whoever leads in AI will lead the world, will dominate the world, to the Russian children, 1st of September, and this is the education program. So the thing that Simondon had experienced at the time is very different from what we have now. But Simondon was right also to say that each epoch must identify, has its own mode of alienation, and each epoch must invent its own humanism. Now, of course, when Simondon talks about humanism, it does not mean human centrism or anthropocentrism. No? So we must not understand what he called humanism as anthropocentrism, but he wanted every epoch has its source of alienation, which is related to technology. Because today we have in your work on mental health or mentality, you know? So there are new phenomena, there are new sources of alienation, and the question is that how can we, or is it possible to think together with Simondon? And how his understanding of technology, the lineage that he has analyzed, how can it help us to understand the problems? The notion of individuation. What would be individuation today for people using Facebook? And that was the project I did with Stigler in 2012 to reinvent or to find alternative models of Facebook. So we have to appropriate Simondon, the canonical concepts of Simondon, his understanding of the relation between nature and technology, culture and technology. These relations are very important to think about. And there was also in concerning encyclopedism, there was something very interesting in the text that was not where there was a part of the PhD thesis that was not published. Is the critique of encyclopedism. The critique of encyclopedism from JeanJacques Rousseau. Rousseau has said that in encyclopedism there is no nature. There is ignorance of nature. There is ignorance of nature in encyclopedism, and this is not what Simondon wants. But of course, nature for Simondon is not a tree, a stone. No. But you have to integrate nature into that, and how? That's the question of individuation. Because when Simondon said, what is nature for Simondon is the individual. In the book on in L'Individuation à la lumière des notions de forme d'information, Simondon says at some point that we can call the pre-individual reality or the pre-individual nature. So there is a kind of reintegrates the technology into the process of individuation, and so that will bring us, of course, to the question of ecology that Anne has mentioned. No? But of course, for me, the problem is that what is ecology? I have a thesis on that, but we don't have time to into that. But so, in general, I think in that for me, I think it's difficult to identify what we call the political philosophy in Simondon. But it is important to think together with Simondon that the problematic. Simondon for me sometimes is like an engineer. I was an engineer, so I know I see very clearly that for him, And the difference from an engineer and a philosopher in general is the engineer, when the driving force for an engineer is to resolve a problem. But in order to resolve a problem, you have to identify a problem. And that is, we can see throughout the writings of Simondon. He's always trying to resolve a problem. It is this incompatibility, this tension, this problematic that drive his writings. So that maybe you can say a kind of philosophical attitude of Simondon. That.
Okay. Sorry. Well, yeah, I mentioned before that Simondon was not an activist. This doesn't mean at all that I believe that there is nothing political in his work. On the contrary, himself he was not an activist, right? But then you have to imagine that Simondon began his studying during the war, the Second World War. And when he arrived at the École Normale Supérieure at the end of the war in 1945, he was completely bored to death by the incapacity of the masters of philosophy in France to be capable to master the transformation of nowadays life. And so when he, after the passing the agrégation, because in France when you do philosophy, you're supposed to go a little bit in high school, in the lycée, right? High school, yeah? Yeah. In high school, in order to do some, social molding, which is, very interesting also. It's a good way it's a good experience for French philosophers, that's for sure. But then Simondon, as a high school teacher in a little town in France, in Tours, what did he do with his students as a professor of philosophy? He, with another class of students, students of the class de cinquième, so it's like teenagers, young teenagers, he made them construct in the basement of the school radar and a television in 50. So it doesn't mean that it is very high technological radar, but in order to bring them into not the technological objectivity, but the technicity, the scheme, the technological scheme. And this, you should understand this in a way as Rousseau, who said that you cannot address philosophical questions from the level of discursivity only. You have to bring them into experience. So that Simondon's way to understand this is that we cannot go through discourse. We have to be in modulation. We have to integrate in a problematic field the functioning of technical objects themselves. And this is completely political. It is political. It is political for a guy being, a philosopher coming from Paris, to explain to people in the country yard that they have to build a radar. How crazy is this, right? And to be capable to make them build this radar or this television, that is, to be capable to bring them into a technological scheme, which is partly the task of an engineer, but it would be the task of a philosophical and political engineer trying to bring the other humans in this type of familiarity where we can change the technological social mold we are captured in order to reinvent our relationship to technology. Yeah. Two questions.
Please, yes. By the way, I was about to open it. Yeah? Sorry, I was just about to say after you finish, right. So we're open officially to the floor. That's a signal I have to make to the cameraman. So. Yeah. So, sorry, please.
So, I continue where you left, because I think while I know where you're coming from when you say, okay, it's not political philosophy, actually Simondon has not a lot to say about society directly, that's absolutely true. But I think if we think about neoliberal capitalism in times of digital technology, and if we think that there has been a transformation where technology has become as important as politics, which before has, we have lived through those times before, we had just religion and politics came, shifted that aside. So there's a specific movement going on, and I think that's the point where this educational approach of Simondon actually makes sense. And Anne said a really good word here. I think scheme, to understand the scheme of technology. I don't think we all need to learn to code, but I think we need to understand the logic of digital technology, or the logic of this element that digital technology is, its technicity, and that's something different than coding. But I think the educational aspect here is quite important. And I think there are two other moments that are quite important. One thing is that he has, in the very end of this book, The Modes of Existence of Technical Objects, he writes about that the technical activity gives rise to the collective group, and that the collective group can arise only because of technology, which actually has been picked up by Paolo Virno as a political statement. And I think that's one thing that's quite important in platform capitalism. And I think it's also then, if you think that further in neoliberal times where the individual has become so important and such a, sort of also isolated node, his notion of thinking the collective in the individual and these two as part of each other, is also a moment then to push back. So I think there are aspects which are very well usable, even though I completely agree that's not a classic political theory, but maybe it's even better because it's not a classic political theory.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I wonder whether actually it is a classical political gesture in philosophy, because Canguilhem made it a classical political gesture. I wonder.
Yeah.
In my feeling, Canguilhem, in the middle of, fascism having entryway into France, decides to go and study medicine and write a theory on the normal and the pathological. It has become, for me, a classical political gesture in philosophy, which I'm asking you. I think perhaps Simondon is emulating by going to the basement of a lycée in France, teaching people to go back to. Emulating is the wrong word in terms of filiation of philosophers. What I'm trying to say is whether this return of philosophy to the contemporary real is a political gesture.
Can I say a few words about this? I do agree with what Mercedes just said. The political accuracy of Simondon's philosophy is that if we do understand his critique on the philosophy of the individual, it is a critique of neoliberalism, of course, because you never can address the question of individual from the level of the individuated, actualized, let's say, on the level of human perception, object. Because for Simondon, it is not only political, it has something to do with the transformation of our world. This conception of object and objectivity is a Cartesian one, right? It's not a bad one, it's a Cartesian one, and we do not live in a Cartesian world anymore. So the main cut that Simondon is addressing is the move from a conception of world where we can localize stuff in space, this would be Cartesian, to a new type of epistemology, and not only epistemology, but also political, let's say, ecology of existence, where our relationship to objectality is no longer this of a piece of matter in a space, but it is a quantum understanding where the level of objectality is only a macro level of perception. So for me, Hook is here an object. I can touch him. If he stays on his feet, probably everything of his body will remain together, I hope, right? But then on this level, it is only the level of macro perception. And so we have to address also the question of a quantic existence. And this is really something that is very much interesting. And so, for your question, for your input, Cécile, I think that it has been very interesting, and for people who are interested also in Guattari, I think there are a few here in the room. you have to imagine that Canguilhem, because he was a resistant, because he went undercover, right, during the Second World War, and so he had to flee. He had to flee as a political opponent to the Nazi regime, and he flew and he took shelter where, in Saint-Alban, which is a clinic in the middle of nowhere in the center of France. The clinic, the main clinic where la psychothérapie institutionnelle, the institutional psychotherapy, was invented in the same time by this amazing Catalan psychiatrist called Tosquelles. And this would lead afterwards Guattari and Uri to open the Laborde Clinic. So it is not random that Canguilhem was in this institution trying to flee. And so in this institution you had political opponents like Tosquelles and like Canguilhem himself, and you have crazy people, right? And so it was a way to make people clear that the idea of marginalization in the culture has to be addressed differently. And so this is very much interesting, yeah. That Canguilhem was capable to transform philosophy from this point of view, that is a point of view that you have to understand the institution, that the institutionalization of truth or of knowledge, as well as the, let's say, metaphysical content of it, right? So it is really, it makes Canguilhem, capable to infuse in French philosophy of those days a political impulse that you can feel very strongly in Foucault, but equally in Simondon.
Well, of course, I said several times that we can, it's possible and it's necessary to read Simondon, the theory of individuation politically, and that was my project, to understand, to use collective individuation to criticize the neoliberal technologies such as Facebook. I think that's necessary. But I think that we also have to move a little bit further than that. And of course you mentioned Paulo Wiener, but his reading of Simondon is a catastrophe. He says he says in that day we first have a psychical individuation and then collective individuation. Come on.
Yeah, of course.
Come on.
How stupid that be.
This is, so, but what I want to say is that well, it's a little bit more complicated because we are no longer in the beginning or in the first half of the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, Heidegger against Descartes, the two-handed against the four-handed. Simondon mobilized Norbert Wiener against the Cartesian cognitive scheme. Actually, it was not technical scheme, cognitive scheme. But we are no longer there. It has been more than 100 years. So what happened next?
Yeah.
When Simondon says that we should not, we should move from molding to moderation, and of course that has very much influenced Deleuze, and you have written a lot on that. And then Deleuze also says that we can use moderation to understand neoliberal capitalism. In the postscript on the societies of control, that the societies of control functions according to moderation, but not molding. So there are kind of maybe you can say that how this kind of critique that we have made also become the new way to describe the problem that we have, the societies of control, surveillance, and so on and so forth. So we have to move a step further, not simply to see that kind of opposition that was necessary, and that was very important in the first half of the 20th century.
Okay, we've got a couple. I don't know who was first, so you can choose democratically. Stefano? Stefano, here.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to. I think when I read Simondon, like for me, the kind of main political thing, going back to your point, Conor, but also whose point about thinking of politics in terms of problems, and the main kind of impetus of, like, or the thrust of his work is that he's recognizing the political problem that we all live in today is increasingly technological in its conditions, that technology has to be taken into consideration when thinking of all of these political problems, kind of what Mercedes said as well. So that thinking as an engineer about politics, like, well, what are the conditions of the problem of politics? Well, increasingly these conditions are technological, which is why we need a technological education that actually allows people to not just be passive observers of the evolution of politics, but actually engaged in the creation of those technological conditions, not just by like a scholastic and theoretical understanding of technology, but actually engaged in the process of technological invention itself. And so that's why I think he would actually not be entirely opposed to the idea of people learning how to code, because that's one way of engaging with technology and inventing new, say, we could argue in applications, maybe a technological element or individual, depending on how we want to frame that. But more importantly, it's about harnessing the power of technology to change the political problem itself and to create new technological conditions for that political problem. So it has to be a question of not just owning technology, but of inventing new inventing new means of production, new technological objects, creating new technological ensembles, new technological individuals to be able to move forward in a particular political direction. Now, he doesn't exactly give us a trajectory to follow, but he gives us kind of this idea of the necessity of a technological politics, which I think is important.
We'll take the other two. Is that okay? If we just take there are two other hands here.
Just take the other one.
Just take the other one, and then yeah, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Go ahead.
This is just to come what Anne was saying about the alienation of culture, and you also talk about alienation, the distance between Simondon and Marxism. I guess I wonder what you thought about this kind of thought experiment. If you think of MEOT as a supplementary thesis, and it's not about technology. Sorry, I'll speak up. It's a supplementary thesis and it's about technology, but in MEOT, the primary phase shift is between technology and religion. And I guess the question is, what would, on the mode of existence of religious beliefs, had he written the other half of the phase shift, what would that look like? And the reason why I ask that is, if you look at the places where Simondon talks about religion, he suddenly looks, I guess, less of a epistemic brain in the 1950s. If you take the technological element out, and you start seeing the profound continuities with Durkheim and a very kind of longer-running French tradition in sociology and anthropology, where the issue of alienation is extremely important and is explicitly distinguished from the Marxist notion of understanding of alienation. So it's an idea of kind of ideological enemy, and there religion plays a central role. So I wonder what you think Simondon looks like if you sort of put technology to one side and concentrate on the other half.
Is it just two? Yeah.
Why not? Yeah, we can throw the book in the garbage and do something else, right? Yeah.
But why? But then what? But why? So, but he still chose to. He wrote the book about technology.
Right.
But technology is only one half of the phase shift. So, is it helpful to, if we want to situate Simondon in that period, is it helpful to concentrate on the technology, or is it maybe more helpful, as helpful, to think about the other half of the phase shift in terms of situating him intellectually in specifically in terms of his politics, because that's where he starts, when he talks about religion, that's where he starts to look like a kind of third republic, Heaney, who wants sort of secondary mediating bodies, civil society, organizations contrasting the power of the state, and so on.
Well, you have to understand, when you write a book, especially when it's a PhD thesis, you have to address a certain audience, right? And the people Simondon was addressing to, they were used to understand the culture as historicity. They were used to believe that sacred objects were okay, or that art was something important in culture. They were not used at all to consider technicity as something philosophical worthwhile. So it is. I mean, it was impossible for Simondon to take this path without arguing with the old generation that religion is okay, magic is okay, etc., etc. But then we have to think that the specificity of technicity. So, on one hand, it is a very useful discussion in order to understand the way that Simondon is positioning technicity in order to transform completely the philosophical understanding of culture. This is for one, right? So it is a transformation of the humanities in general. But the second point is that doing so, Simondon entraps himself in a certain kind of a categorization, and I believe, and this is something that I said earlier, a lot of the article, and I remember we were together in Berlin like 5 years ago, you know, and we had this discussion that because he wants to rethink technical objects, he acts as if we could separate the objects into technical, sacred, and artistic. And this obviously cannot stand, because once you have a philosophy of technical object, I mean, how could you say that a sacred object or an art object is not always a technical object? Of course, they are not technical objects leading in the human culture to, let's say, an understanding of technicity. But does it mean that they are not technical? I mean, would you really believe that, for instance, a painting, let's say Mona Lisa, or a sacred object, let's say Saint Peter in Rome, or let's say the Canterbury Cathedral here, it is obviously technical also, right? So this, after Simondon, we have to cease to speak about technical objects and to distinguish them from sacred religious objects or artistic objects. But in the days of Simondon, he couldn't make this step because he needed this sacred religious and artistic object in order to make his point. So you have to read this as a categorization that was necessary in those days to be capable to address the question of technique, right? And then today, if we are dealing with Simondon, of course we cannot say that only some kind of object manufactured artifacts in human societies are technical and other are not. They are all technical, but they do not have the same level of technicity, and most importantly, so you can address the same type of objects from the level of technicity. Let's say I can see the cathedral. It is a cathedral, right? I can see it as a machine, a typical machine of the pre-Renaissance, right? And I can address it in its technicity as well. Okay, so when you are transforming philosophy, you need them, but afterwards you have to go to another type of technicity. And it doesn't mean that Simondon was wrong. It means only that you cannot consolidate every phase of a transformation very easily. So you have to go through certain kind of distinctions, right? And if you read this part of the book, this is probably the most old-fashioned, and it is related also with the fact that Simondon is discussing with Mircea Eliade. He is a historian of the history of religion, and it is very important because in his books, Eliade develops the idea that sacred or religious object has a certain kind, let's say, I'm a Christian, or, they have a kind of, Eliade writes, hierophany. So finite, they have a kind of a capacity a capacity of apparition, and this apparition is the apparition of sanctity, of hierophany. And so Simondon takes this in order to understand the technophany, the way that technicity appears. Okay, so it is complicated, but nevertheless, it does not mean that Simondon thought that in the human landscape you've got population of religious objects, then population of artistic objects, and then population of only technical objects. One of the key examples in order to understand this would be the Eiffel Tower, not only because I live in Paris, right? But the Eiffel Tower is firstly a monument for industrialization and human slavery, okay? Because it was built as something to praise the metallurgical and thermodynamic extreme violent capitalism. We are capable to produce steel like this. We are capable to build up this Eiffel Tower. And you know that when it was built, everybody in Paris said, we have to destroy it immediately because this is not culture, this is really the opposite of culture. But then, this Eiffel Tower has become the sort of symbol, the sort of artistic, aesthetic symbol of Paris. But his technical skill is not only its technical skill of the Eiffel Tower. It's not only that it is constructed of iron steel. It is also that now it is a very important factor for network because it is a porteur d'antenne. So it is a construction that allows antennas for radio diffusion and television and now internet. And so the same object can be taken in different dispositives.
No, I have a rather different reading of that because it doesn't mean that I disagree with you.
It's okay. Well.
Because I think that no, your question is very, very tricky. It says if Simondon approached from the side of technology, what will it look like if approached from the perspective of religion? Now we have to understand that when Simondon talked about the bifurcation, that was a problem. But this problem is also an internal necessity, the constant bifurcation, technique and religion. What you want to do is that how can we converge? Converge in what sense? Converge in the sense that the figures are attached again to the ground. And this is Gestalt psychology throughout the whole book. How is this possible at all? Now, in the first phase of bifurcation, that is to say, that the magic phase is bifurcated into techniques and religion. There was the aesthetic thinking. Aesthetic thinking wanted to converge these two, wanted to bring them back to the figure back to the ground. That was aesthetic thinking. Mm-hmm. It was very effective. But Simondon continued by saying that it is not sufficient when the bifurcation continues. When techniques bifurcate into theory process, religion bifurcated into dogma and ethics, and continues. Aesthetic thinking is no longer able to do this function. Now what we need, and this has to be qualified, is what he called philosophical thinking. Now there is the task of thinking. The task of thinking in the sense of Heidegger. There was the task of thinking that Simondon proposed. But how does it look like? That is our task. To think with Simondon, because this is the foundation of what I call Cosmotechnics. The whole theory is based on this idea of philosophical thinking to attach figures to the ground. So the question is not that approaching from technique to resolve problem or religion to resolve problem. Towards the end, technical concretization is not a solution. You need to resituate technology within a genesis of technicity itself in order to understand the problem and to resolve it. Okay. I don't know if that answers your question, but from here we can also see the question of spirituality that is present in Simondon. He's Catholic, no? He is but I want to add one thing to the question of alienation, because I forgot to say about it, is that Simondon was talking about a double alienation. Double.
Double.
What is it, a double alienation? Alienation of human being and the alienation of technical object. Alienation of technical object. What is the meaning of alienation of technical object? There was an article called by Simondon called Techniques et eschatologie, le devenir des objets techniques. I have a commentary on that is published already. There is an address of this question of alienation and spirituality, and a point to me, it seems that for Simondon there is a kind of question of the soul of technical objects. And the alien, especially when you talk about alienation of technical object, what does it really mean by that? Well, we can understand it in a few senses. One is that when we see a robot, we see it as a slave. We treat them as slave. There was also a second instance of alienation of technical objects. And the example he gave is really weird. He says, with the emergence of consumerism, we see that these technical objects are manufactured and they are put in the market like the slaves of the Roman time. They are waiting to be bought. Now look, now at the supermarket, or you go to a shop where you buy electronic devices, these are all alienated objects because they don't know when they will be bought. They are in what he says, they are in
purgatory, waiting.
Yeah, they are in a mode of waiting. They don't know when they will be bought, but they were manufactured in order to be used, but not to wait. So that we can say that is a critique of consumerism, but it's also if we go a step further, that there is a kind of spirituality that Simondon associated with technical objects. But this is a delicate hypothesis because they can go into animism, which I don't think that he is an animist.
So I've noticed the time, and I believe the wine is waiting to be utilized. So that might be a fairly neat place to.
This is completely not Simondon.
Well, I know, right? That was the point. So unless there are any closing comments, that might be a good place to stop on. And yeah, thank you everyone, and thanks to Anne, and thanks to you.